Hello, everybody, and welcome to tonight's Fireside Chat with Lyndon LaRouche for Thursday, February 17th. So let me go right into it by referencing something that I wrote a couple days ago for our international briefing. It said, while there will be multiple shifts of the international political terrain in the next hours, Saturday's Schiller Institute conference, 100 seconds to midnight on the doomsday clock, we need a new security architecture, starting at 10 a.m., by the way, subsumes those momentary shifts in the tactical landscape. As Lyndon LaRouche, the founder of Executive Intelligence Review, once said in a different but comparable circumstance, quote, the world has entered a transitional period in which old habits of judgment and orientation are useless and even contraindicated for practical evaluation of most of the emerging phenomena of the strategic and national tactical developments. For this reason, very few people in the world are intellectually pre-trained to understand those processes which will be decisive in determining the outcome of this immediate several weeks and months directly before us. The reason that's an important thing, particularly for tonight and to discuss tonight, we'll say a few things about what's going on ostensibly out there in tactics land, is that the topic that we chose was thermonuclear fusion, or actually Paul Gallagher chose the topic. And the issue, of course, in the mind might be, well, wait a minute, isn't thermonuclear fusion always 30, 40, 50, 100 years away? Why would that be a determining factor in the next hours, days, or weeks? Well, that's going to be an interesting thing to discuss, but let me just point out that the things that we are told determine what happens day by day clearly don't. Caitlin Johnstone, who is a blogger, did an article on February 15th, 2 days ago, called The Official Story. And she says the following. She says, the official story is that we live in a free democracy where our teachers tell us the truth about our nation, our government, and our world when we are children. And then the free press continue telling us the truth about our nation, government, and the world when we are grown. And then every few years we have free and fair elections in which we use this truthful information to make decisions about which politicians and policies to vote for. And it is only by pure coincidence that what we vote for just so happens to benefit the most wealthy and powerful people on the planet. And so that I think is of relevance to thinking about official stories, public opinion, generally recognized truths, and what people invariably call the obvious. We're in a circumstance in which none of the normal reflexes are at work. The fact that, of course, we had a sort of a bit of a shakeup on the stock exchanges today. But more importantly, what we have is stories continually being told to us, even at this moment, that there are 150,000 troops in Russia, Belarus, and Crimea, and they are prepared to invade within days. This is Blinken is still saying this. Tony Blinken of the State Department is still saying these stories. So despite the fact that people complained about QAnon correctly, but you have UAnon in the case of Ukraine, where, the event that was said to occur didn't occur, but they keep saying, no, it's going to occur. And not only is it going to occur, you'd have to be anti-American or anti-European or anti-NATO to believe otherwise. Faced with this sort of lunacy, but of course it is lunacy by design, it's good to in that circumstance hear about something that is actually driving reality, and then look at this circumstance, certainly a dangerous one, but nonetheless a lunatic discussion, and look at it in that context. Look at it in relief, in other words. So Paul chose the topic, and I'd like him to go right ahead and tell us why he chose it, what he's got to say, and of course he may have a preface to it all. So we'll go right to him. So, Paul, you now have the floor and also the window and the rest of the house, too, if you want to use it.
Okay, and the mic, too. So I'd appreciate if anybody would point out if I'm not coming across loudly enough. I'm doing this on speaker on my phone, and I could go to speaking directly into it if it's a problem. But I'll start by saying that the reason I chose this topic, number one, there have been important developments. I think many people may have heard something about them, at least in the area of fusion energy experimentation. There have been some breakthroughs recently. So that, given the crucial importance of fusion energy and plasma technologies for the whole future of the human race, that's worth looking into. But there's something else, and I'm going to look into it primarily not from a scientific standpoint. That would be really above my level of capability, but rather from an economic standpoint. And I hope to get some help in the course of this from the LaRouche independent candidate for Congress down in Houston, Joel DeJong, who I hope is lurking near a phone somewhere and knows a great deal about this. But there is another reason, and that is that you see, as Dennis referred, you see the Biden administration spokesman, all of them, the cabinet members, the National Security Council members, and so on, furiously at this point challenging Russia to some kind of duel over and over and over again, refusing, like in the old days with the glove, you will not leave the field. I challenge you again. Challenging them, not only Russia, but also China, continuously to a battle of some kind, at the minimum to a deep Cold War. And sensible people have understood by this time that Russia and China themselves have entered into a pretty solid economic and strategic partnership, which means that our knights errant are repeatedly challenging that partnership to potentially a very, very deadly duel, and doing it over and over again. With what are they doing it? They're doing it with an economy which is really does not have very much time left before it collapses. It's been more than 2 years, the U.S. economy, unable to return to the levels of employment or productive employment or industrial production or manufacturing from 2019. Still not there. Lost 3.5 million people from the workforce, the American workforce, in that period of time. That's the only reason that unemployment seems to be quite low, because the workforce has shrunk by that amount. 2 years, more than 2 years of zero growth in lending by the entire U.S. banking system, while their deposits grew by more than 40%. Just one comparison, China's banks lending grows by 10% or more every year. And 25 years in the U.S. banking system in which the bank's speculative assets have been bought with their deposits. They've run their deposits into speculation now to the extent of 41% of all of their $18 trillion worth of deposits in pure speculation. And in the biggest of the banks, which dominate the whole system, more than half in speculation of their huge deposit base in speculation. It's not accidental that in fusion itself, in the race, if you have it, or it's not been much of a race, in the attempt over decades to develop more and more competent experiments approximating producing power with through thermonuclear fusion, that the most dynamic programs now are those in Asia, particularly in South Korea, and even more so in China. The most moribund of programs is that in the United States, if you leave out the participation in the big international experiment, which is slowly being built to begin to operate in 2035, roughly, in Europe. So in this and in many other ways, these furious Don Quixotes of the Biden administration, and even more so of Boris Johnson, Bojo the Clown, the British Crown government over there, these people are playing from a completely empty deck in the challenge to war that they're making. And now that the central banks of the United States and Europe over this extended period of the last 15 years basically have created a essentially dead monster of the U.S. economy and of the U.S. banking system, they've been trying to inject electricity into it in the form of massive printing of money, and in the process they've set off tremors in the limbs of the economy, and those tremors have turned into spasms, and you have inflation, which is tending towards an impulse for hyperinflation. And it is no longer just notable, it's now have gotten painful. It's lowering the standards of living in the United States and Europe. It's threatening the lives of millions of people around the world through inflation in food and in the ability to grow and produce food. This hyperinflation is not going to be controlled by manipulating interest rates. Volcker did that in the 1980s, but he half destroyed the economy, destroyed the small and medium-sized business half of the economy in doing it completely, and produced the deepest recession before the Great Recession of 2008 to 10. But Volcker, even then, had a period before he crushed the economy with 20% interest rates. He had a period in which business lending in the banking system was growing very rapidly. The Federal Reserve is now dealing with exactly the opposite, which it itself has created. It can't do that. It can't do that at all without producing a thorough economic crash and financial implosion. The only way out of this is rapid increases in the technological productivity in the economy, not in GDP, but in productivity, which can gradually bring the inflation under control, very gradually, without an economic crash. Now, then there's, however, the deeper physical economic problem. In the 50 years in which the lack of funding has resulted in very, very snail-like progress in the attempt to harness fusion energy, essentially the failure to do that in all this period of time, we have instead had the IT revolution, what's called the fourth industrial revolution, the revolution in communications, or the revolution, the age of cybernetics. And this has taken place against the background of a monetary system that's pure casino since the end of Bretton Woods in the 1970s, and in which, therefore, speculation has the incentive, productive investment does not. So even that so-called fourth industrial revolution, the technology revolution, has mainly taken on the forms of incredible speeds at which stock transactions can be carried out, that sort of thing, to where these stock transactions can actually be completed before they're even started, and incredible speeds of other kinds of speculation of that sort. But this revolution has not produced any productivity. It's not just my view or our view of this, or Lyndon LaRouche's view of it. An economist named Robert Gordon wrote a book in 2016. He's very well known. Actually, I believe won a Nobel Prize, but that's a little bit like contracting COVID, but he seems to have recovered from it. He wrote a book in 2016, The Rise and Fall of American Growth. And in that book, 7 years ago, he said, he gave an interview about it the next year, 2017. He said, my book forecasts going out 25 years into the future, productivity growth of 1.2%, which is very low. And he goes on, which is not that different than it was in the 40 years since 1970, the 40 years before that, the 40 years at that point, of the floating exchange rate monetary system. Labor productivity growth in the U.S., he says, has only been 1.4% a year since 1970, and I'm predicting a slight slowdown even in that. Now, he undershot because in the 5 years since that interview, U.S. labor productivity has grown by less than 1% a year. And I've read the whole book. It's a very, very thorough description of the impact in every way on everyday life and on industry and on the economy as a whole of every major invention in the U.S. economy since the invention of the railroads. The steam engine, the railroad, the telegraph, the internal combustion engine, those kinds of the development of electricity, those kinds of inventions he's analyzing. And among all of them, he says the one which produced no discernible growth in productivity, now over more than 40 years when he was writing, is the IT revolution. So that essentially happened instead of the development of the frontiers of the laser industrial revolution, which was called for by Lyndon LaRouche in the middle 1980s as part of his SDI policy, which Reagan had adopted. He gave some memorable speeches in 1984, in particular, in 1983, at large conferences in Washington in front of hundreds of people, in which he called for a laser industrial revolution which was spread throughout the globe as a result of U.S. and Soviet cooperation in the development of anti-missile defense systems using what they call relativistic beams, beams that travel at or very near the speed of light. Lasers, everything from radar up through the very, very short wave X-ray lasers, all the beams in between, particle beams, electron beams. That revolution that LaRouche was forecasting, and he was saying even then that it was overdue in 1983 and 1984, that it was overdue for the explosion of these technologies into industry. But in that same time, those same years, he said very clearly in his Moon Mars mission and similar, the videos, the speeches, putting forth that vision of the Moon Mars mission and of deep space exploration together with his collaborators, he said that the development of the laser and plasma revolutions in technology will be part of a space colonization effort. They must be. That's the way they will occur. And he said this in 1984 in a document called the LaRouche Doctrine, or colloquially among us called the LaRouche Doctrine. Quote, advances in technology are transmitted into the productive process as a whole through the incorporation of improved technologies in capital goods, most emphatically capital goods of the machine tool or analogous classifications. They're the only means by which a national economy can sustain significant rates of technological progress is by placing emphasis upon the capital goods sector of production and maintaining sufficiently high rates of turnover in that sector to foster high rates of technological innovation in the goods produced. The only avenue for this to occur, it's as true now as it was in the mid-'80s when LaRouche said it, the only avenue for this to occur was a crash effort to develop and use new technologies in space exploration and in fusion power production. But not fusion power necessarily as a limited subject of the production of electric power with fusion reactors, but plasma technologies. Then the two of them, space and fusion, space and plasma revolution, are the same crash program, as LaRouche always emphasized at that time, and they came out of the SDI and his idea of a laser industrial revolution that had to spread throughout the world, together with the electricity to back it up. And that, of course, nuclear and then fusion electricity. So this was then, and now in a situation of complete desperation for the United States and the European economies as well. This is and not just desperation, but hyperinflation. This is the only pathway out, the only conceivable pathway for the kind of productivity increases that can handle this situation without a complete economic crash. Now, again, you say, well, but fusion power, that's said to be 30 years away. So how is it going to deal with this imminent financial blowout or economic crash? Well, again, we've had a number of fusion power breakthroughs in experimentation recently. We can go through them, but if I give you just an idea of productivity, here's one. The amount of energy released by the burning of black coal is about 1 gram of it. 1 gram of it is about 34 kilojoules. That's something like 10 watt hours. In other words, a very feeble light bulb burning for an hour. The energy released by the burning, and this is what happens, of U-235 fission fuel, enriched uranium fuel, is about a gram of it, is about 1 megajoule. That's more like 250 watt hours, or a serious light bulb burning for an hour and a half. From 1 gram of deuterium-tritium fusion fuel, which is the least efficient of the fusion fuels, but the one that has been worked on the most so far, from 1 gram of that, the energy released can be 3 to 4 gigajoules. That's more like 1 megawatt hour, or in other words, a full-size house, all-electric house, operating, being lived in and used for a month. 1 gram of fusion fuel. So that should give you an idea of the power density and therefore the potential productivity of the use of this fuel. But what we're talking about here is not fusion power. It does not rely on the use of fusion, and in fact, we don't, for the coming decades that we might talk about that it would take to develop working, efficient fusion electric reactors. For that period of time, we don't need them. And all this stuff from the greenies about it, can fusion now save the carbon-free electricity production? In that period of time, we don't need them. The expansion of advanced fission power and third and fourth generation fission power, the addition of literally thousands of gigawatts of power around the world, something on the order of 8 to 10,000 gigawatts of power needed around the world. These this can be done with the development of advanced fission reactors, and it should be, and it will be done. The countries which we're challenging to a death duel at this point are the world leaders in making it possible for nations all over the world to meet this challenge with advanced fission power reactors. So the point is not when are you going to have thermonuclear fusion reactors producing electricity. The point is what is the technological revolution which a crash program of Moon and Mars colonization, exploration and colonization and development combined with, and it would have to be combined with, the crash development of thousands and thousands and thousands of lines of experimentation in fusion reactions and in plasma technologies. This is what would produce the kind of technological of productivity revolution that is solely capable of pulling the world economy out of the hole that it's in right now. And as things stand now, if that occurs, it will be led by China and Russia and some of the other leading nations of Eurasia, period. Nonetheless, this is possible for the United States. There have been some breakthroughs recently which have been notable in what they show. First of all, they show, and I'm not going to attempt to go into any of these in detail, as I said, or from a scientific standpoint. But what they show, first, that fusion scientists and engineers are coming very close to keeping super hot plasmas contained for sustained periods of time even up to minutes. Some experimental devices are generating plasmas which are more stable the hotter they get. In other words, the greater heat involved, which should be driving the plasma apart, the more stable and contained the configuration of it becomes in some of these experiments. Second, several of these have come very close to achieving ignited, or sometimes called burning plasmas, where the fusion process is spreading through the fuel and generating more energy, at least for a very short period of time, generating more energy than is needed to keep it contained and stable, and that has been needed to start it burning. That, in particular, has characterized two results which have come through in 2021 and the first month of 2022. One from Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories at what's called the National Ignition Facility there, where scientific papers written after the August experimentation have actually shown that on the very small scale of this very small pellet of potential fusion fuel, about 10 milligrams is what it is, on the scale of that pellet, more energy was produced out by the burning of that fuel than had been deposited on the fuel in order to ignite it and get it to burn. More energy was produced coming out in the very short time before the fuel expanded to the point where it cooled down and stopped burning. And the other was just a few weeks ago, the Joint European Torus, which is located in England, but is essentially part of the development of the ITER, the International Tokamak Experimental Reactor in France, Cadarache, France, which is being built there. It's essentially a pre-experiment for that. And that one managed to keep fuel contained and superheated for more than 5 seconds, and to produce by fusion reactions in that period of time about 60 megajoules of power. That was by far a record. The interesting thing about these reactions, aside from the fact that they represent jumps in progress, two interesting things. One is the Joint European Torus having just achieved by far this record in power production in a fusion plasma. That experiment now does not have funding from the European Commission, in the European Commission budget, does not have funding to continue any longer. It's being debated, there's a big hullabaloo about it, but at the moment, it has no funding to continue this line of experimentation. Similarly, the National Ignition Facility and Lawrence Livermore Lab, that program was threatened with being closed down and confined entirely to testing nuclear warheads, which is what it otherwise does. That program was threatened with being entirely closed down until it achieved in August this extraordinary and unexpected result, which actually turned out to be a net gain in energy for a very, very short period of time. That's number one. The second notable thing about these and many other of the experiments is that they have combined what most people think are the two different kinds of fusion experimentation. One being with the big magnets, tokamaks and so forth, that use big magnets to confine superhot plasmas. The other being with lasers or particle beams, which are used to hit and shock and very rapidly compress small amounts of fuel so that to the point where the fuel begins to burn, hopefully. These experiments, which are now going on, combine the two. And in fact, virtually any fusion experiment that you can read about at this point, if you read deeply enough into it, what they're really doing, they are combining the two. They involve the combined development of superconducting magnets, magnetic fields produced by electric currents, which magnetic fields pinch the plasma to contain it, and the use of lasers and particle beams, which make the plasmas more dense while they superheat rather than the opposite. So this plasma industrial revolution, which could come out of what is now a significant number of combined experiments. Now, the Fusion Energy Foundation, back in the mid-1970s, in what was called the Fusion Energy Foundation newsletter, which then developed into the Fusion magazine. When it was still the newsletter already, it was covering, writing articles about combined magnetic and inertial confinement fusion, and foreseeing the process, which is now becoming clearer and clearer in many, many of these fusion experiments, that they are in fact combining magnetic and inertial confinement fusion into the same experiments. And so in the process, they are, or they would be, if they had any funds at all to work with, and really all they have is what they can scrounge from Google or some other venture capitalist, who's tired of funding whatever that was called, Theranos, and now wants to put some money into a fusion experiment. All they can, if they had funds of a crash federal program to explore space and develop fusion and plasma technologies, they would all be simultaneously developing new technologies of lasers, of particle beams, of superconducting magnets, which some of these experiments have done, and of the use of strong electric currents in order to produce very strong collapsing magnetic fields and confine plasmas and do many other things with plasmas in an industrial sense. In presenting this to you to begin with, I don't really want to go through all those kinds of things to begin with, but think of it as of what could be done at this point as what Vannevar Bush was charged by Franklin D. Roosevelt to do in 1938, which was Vannevar Bush, who was then had started the company which later became Raytheon in the early 1930s, and he was then at MIT in 1938, agreed to become head of the National Defense Research Committee, which then became the Office of Scientific Research and Development for World War II, and was on top of the development of the fundamental technologies that, of course, initially won the war from radar on, and computing technologies and so forth, which carried through the Manhattan Project, eventually carried through the Apollo Project, essentially the technologies on which our economies have been working ever since, came as a result of the work of that committee. If you think of such a committee reconstituted and targeting in particular the campuses, the major universities, and those all those universities which have at least potential very strong scientific and mathematical physics programs, such a targeting would be producing a laser industrial revolution. Just to give one example, semiconductor, the thing that everyone obsesses about in Washington now, the development of new revolutionary technologies in production of semiconductors and other electronic circuits, that printing of circuits and production of semiconductors, which is famous for having continuously become more productive for the entire period of the last 50 years, that's driven by the development of lasers, electron and particle beams. That just gives you one example. Fusion propulsion rockets. These do not require plasmas at 100 to 200 million degrees Celsius, which is what you read about when you read the stories on these fusion experiments. They rather require ion streams, plasmas, at about 10 million degrees centigrade or less, accelerated by a strong electric field out the back of a rocket. Fusion torches, in order to separate and reprocess materials of every kind. These have been worked on for a long time, again, without any particular program, any funding. Nonetheless, a few scientists have worked on these for a long time. They are probably first needed for the processing of materials in space, on other moons or planets. They are the exhaust plasma that leaks out of fusion devices. They are at much lower temperatures than the temperatures required in those fusion power devices. Again, in the range of 10 million degrees centigrade or down to as low as 4 or 5 million. And that means they are not incapable of being handled by any material known at this point, as the fusion plasmas in the power experiments are. They can only be contained by magnetic fields because no known material could stand up against 150 million degrees Celsius. These torch applications and fusion propulsion applications are much, much lower temperatures than that. They are essentially, in a sense, using the exhaust plasma that leaks out of fusion experiments and is cooled in the process, that needs to be rapidly moved in a direction by magnetic fields or electric fields. And that means that they need more advanced fusion fuels which don't produce neutrons. Same thing that is needed eventually to produce nuclear fusion power. Helium-3, which can be mined on the moon, with fusion torches. Helium-3 or proton boron fuel, these require extraordinarily high temperatures to make power with them, but they are also the fuels for plasmas to be used in plasma processes. There's also what they're called cold plasmas, which are not for industrial uses, but for medical plasmas, and there are many, many of them. They can be plasmas as low as 40 degrees centigrade up to maybe 300 degrees centigrade. In fact, these kinds of plasmas are developed in particular all over New Jersey. I know that the Seton Hall, one of the universities in New Jersey, proposes that New Jersey change its name to the plasma state because it is the national center of all of this kind of research, and not just research, but development and successful application and commercialization of all kinds of plasma applications. This is nonetheless the most important of these. Another example, the use of plasma control surfaces to control the maneuvering of supersonic and hypersonic vehicles in flight. That's a major area for this kind of plasma technology revolution. There are a lot of such areas as that. This kind of research, New Jersey would naturally, if you had such a Vannevar Bush committee that was deciding with a very large research and development budget to conduct a crash program, that's probably where it would be sent. The university side of it would be centered there to begin with. So this obviously can go on for decades while hopefully thermonuclear fusion power, production of electricity, is successfully developed and simply because that will be so much more productive and so much cheaper than any other form of electricity. We need to get there. We need to produce the kind of electricity which can power an extraterrestrial human civilization everywhere that it has colonized or is developing or is mining and developing in the solar system. But this is not the tremendous productivity and technological advances which will come out of pursuing these fusion breakthroughs are not things that will wait 30 years for the production of electric power, but rather they will be developed in the process. As soon as the public support for a real Moon-Mars mission and a real space colonization program to be resumed, as soon as that is there, the potential for a crash program in plasma technologies and the development of fusion power is there as well. So that gives an opportunity, at least, for the U.S. economy to come out of the hole that it's in if it's accompanied by breaking up these banks and reorganizing the banking system so that credit can flow to it. So that's what I'd like to say to start with.